Hi, welcome to Equals Mathematics 2.0, Alternate Assessment, Placement, and Grouping. I'm Karen Ross Brown from AbleNet. Today, we're going to cover an alternative way to assess students for placement and grouping into Equals Math rather than using the included Equals assessment. In looking at the Equals assessment, we know that that assessment is divided into 6 subtests: numbers and operations, algebra, geometry, measurement, data analysis and probability, and attending and exploring. The first 5 in orange are from the National Council of Teachers Mathematics content areas, whereas attending and exploring has been added by AbleNet to cover pre-readiness and readiness math skills if a student comes into school with little or no experience in math or math instruction. These all make up the Equals assessment subtests, but know that when you look at the Equals lessons, they are ordered differently. We do not have a numbers and operations book, an algebra book, a geometry book, and so on. But rather, the lessons take advantage of that interconnectedness of those content areas. And the lessons have been placed in an order so that students learn prerequisite skills that support the next set and subsequent sets of skills, not only within a content area, but between the content areas as well. So that lesson to lesson progression of learning is present, going from least difficult in Chapter 1, Section A, Lesson 1, to most difficult at the end of Chapter 12. This same progression of learning happens within a lesson as well, beginning with activating and building background knowledge, adding experience with tools and learning strategies, solving problems, communicating about math, showing what I know, and practice and application of those skills. Students learn again within that lesson in that order to build that learning slowly in that order. Now, looking again at the progression of learning, we see that this order is dependent upon for students learning over time and must be preserved when teaching those lessons. But when students are taking the Equals assessment, you're going to see that subtest view that doesn't look like the progression of learning that you see in the lessons. So when we created that list of lesson objectives, as you can see an example on the screen, we narrowed what you would see in Gen Ed to support students' understanding and build that knowledge over time. So when we pulled those apart, that provided a natural set of prerequisite skills. And we know that the concepts that the students are currently being taught will be used and built upon in future lessons. So how are students placed in Equals? Well, first, I need to say that whatever your district requires of you for assessing your students for placement in a curriculum, you need to follow those guidelines first. From our point of view, there are a few ways to look at placement into Equals. One way would be to recognize that your student requires prerequisite skills in pre-readiness and readiness. And you feel perfectly comfortable placing a student or students in Chapter 1. Where in Chapter 1 is up to you. Looking at Chapter 1, if you feel you have a student or students in a group who require that kind of instruction for pre-readiness and readiness, Chapter 1 is it. And you do not need to use the assessment to place them there if you are solid in that belief. Another way is the alt assessment that we're talking about today, either using the contents pages from the overview manual or the electronic scoring document, which will show both. That might be your final placement. I'm using the alternate assessment, and I'm going to place my students from there. Or I can place my students at the beginning of the year with the alternate assessment and confirm it with the equals assessment later, just to make sure that I've got the groups right. All of those are the legitimate ways to place students in equals. Some things you might want to pay attention to as you move through past chapter 1 into skills that you see beyond that pre-readiness readiness would be general counting skills, like counting in number order, counting a set with one-to-one correspondence, counting to a given amount with one-to-one correspondence, identifying numerals, ordering and comparing amounts, that kind of thing. Might be measuring amounts, weight and length, identifying money, tell time to hour, half hour, quarter hour, 5 minutes, etc. Can the student identify shapes and colors? How about knowledge of those attributes in sorting and making, duplicating, and extending patterns? Creating and analyzing graphs, all sorts of graphs, right? Object graphs, pictographs, barline graphs, and then using the knowledge of those graphs to compare for that analysis. And then knowledge of the 4 operations: single digit, multiple digit, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. So basics of math, just to be aware of what the student knows. There may be students who have more advanced skills in numbers and operations, but are missing attributes and color and shape identification. And you might have to take a look at chapter 1 and see if there's something in there. Maybe that you're surprised to see that maybe your students are missing some readiness skills. Those all support graphs and being able to sort data appropriately. There are some tools to help you do this. One would be looking at electronic scoring, and you can find that in your equals 2009-2011 members only digital content assessment folder, and then open that up and you see equals assessment folder, and you will see an Excel spreadsheet, electronic scoring. You would need a copy of that, and that, when I mean a digital copy of that electronic scoring for each student. You can also use the vocabulary data tracker. So in the same members only digital content, looking at the assessment folder, and then look for data tracking, and then look for the Excel spreadsheet that's labeled vocabulary, and you'll see vocabulary that is listed for every lesson, review, and new. You could also use the printed equals overview manual from the content kit. If you would like that paper view of all the lessons in order from chapter 1 through chapter 12, it's at the beginning of that overview manual. And you can even copy those if you'd like to. And if you prefer to use that than the electronic scoring, that's entirely up to you. So let's look at that part of it first, the content pages from the overview manual. We'll look at that, and then we'll put on the side, we'll put that vocabulary spreadsheet that I mentioned earlier with all of the vocabulary listed for review and new words. We want to identify and mark known concepts, or at least if you're not going to mark them, to write them down, what you feel is known. I think it's simpler to highlight or mark for each student. But not only the known concepts, but the context, within that context of related concepts. So my student might know, for example, in this section A, counting to 5 and constructing a set to match 1 and 2. Now, if that's the case, can I reasonably assume that my student would know these 3 at the beginning of this section? And I'd say it's pretty likely yes, because this is a progression of learning. So that would be the context of related concepts. Can I assume if my student has some of these, they have most or all of them? Okay, so in looking here, I would say that's probably true. When I look at counting to 5, constructing a set to match 1 and 2, writing numerals 1 and 2 to match the sets, I'd say more than likely my student can recognize 2 as more than 1, they can match sets of 2 and 1, and identify the amounts of 2 and 1. Those are prerequisite skills, so I'm thinking that's probably true. Section B, I'm looking here that same student can demonstrate one-to-one correspondence. That's great. That's a necessary skill. Student can construct a set to match the numerals of 3 and 4 and can write the numerals 3 and 4 to match the sets. That's okay, that's good. My student is really solid here in counting sets 1 through 4. And then can my student demonstrate cardinality of numbers? So if I ask how many circles did you count, my student answers with the amount counted. Let's say it's 4, rather than starting counting all over again. That's cardinality, recognizing that the last number stated when you finish counting is the amount and the answer to the question, how many? So now if I can check concepts, we skipped over that, but you can check the concepts if you're not sure if the student knows something or not. So you can have some materials ready and just ask the student and you can see if they struggle with it or if they're pretty confident, you know that they've got it. If you need additional information for any of these lesson objectives, you can go and look in the teacher's guides and jump to the concrete, semi-concrete abstract view, which gets right to the heart of the concept. You might want to look at problem solving as well and see what strategies are there, or what tools are used. You can look around that lesson a bit and see, would my student know how to do this? Well, after I've looked at all of this and also I've looked at the vocabulary, and does my student know what how many means? Count, numbers, the numerals 1 and 2, the word right, set, total. Am I feeling secure that my student knows all of those? If not, I will ask my student to demonstrate maybe, right? But if I'm feeling pretty good about it, I could look at this and say, yep, I think my student has those prerequisite skills to be able to move on to counting 5 and 6, beginning with counting to 10. And that would be my beginning placement. From that point forward, I'd be teaching lessons, then finishing up chapter 2 and move on to 3, etc. It is important to know that grouping is a compromise. Not every student is going to have the exact same concepts learned. So it's important to know that some students might end up learning a lesson over again that they already knew. We'll talk about the benefits in a moment to that happening. You might want to consider how many groups are manageable for your classroom. That is a consideration. It certainly is most important above and beyond that. What I believe is most important is that you do not have one student learning by themselves. The benefits of grouping are really greater than that. So unless it's absolutely the student is way far away from everybody else, I would try to get those groups together as much as possible. You don't want to be grouping based on levels of differentiation. So if you have a student who needs level 1 support versus level 2 support, don't let that be your consideration. It's more the chapter and section that supports the student group members' knowledge. That's how we're placing is by what they know about math, not the kind of support that they need. The review of lessons prior to the current lesson is okay if you feel it's necessary. So if you are teaching a lesson and you're thinking, wow, my students don't have this vocabulary. I see that it was provided before, and oh, they really are in line to be learning this. This might be a little bit too difficult for them. What can I do to support them? You can find a lesson that would support what they need. Teach that first and then go back to where you left off and teach that lesson. So usually the difference is if that happens, and it doesn't happen often, it's usually like a vocabulary or a concept related to a vocabulary word the students aren't getting. So it is okay though to do that. You just don't want to be bouncing back and forth, and that's what makes good placement so important. As I mentioned at the beginning, because grouping is a compromise, but there are benefits to grouping students together. The benefits beyond just learning the lesson objective. If a student is placed in a lesson that's great for everybody else, but that student already knows that concept, what else they can learn from that lesson is a benefit to them. So it's could be more of a focus on solving problems. It could be more of a focus on a deeper meaning of the concept, reviewing the vocabulary. Any of those things could take precedence for that student because they already know the lesson objective. You find other things in the lesson that the student can work on that will be of benefit to them. I think solving problems, getting that process down is probably one of the most important ones. The benefits in grouping students together, we know it's beneficial for students to have shared experiences, to share with each other, to communicate. That is huge in not only increasing math knowledge, but also increasing communication between the students in general. And we've seen a lot of that growing over the last several years. So let's take a look at some example math groups. So what I have here is a list of math groups that I've color-coded to make sense of where I'm thinking these students will be placed. So I have 2 students that would be in chapter 1, 3 students I'm thinking will end up in chapter 3, and 3 students will end up being in chapter 6. Where they begin, though, within that chapter, is up to me. So when I look at these groups, when I look at my 2 students I think should be in chapter 1, I'm considering placing them both in 1B, 1C, or 1D. I'm always cautious about moving students too far ahead of where they are. So I think I would take 1D out of that equation, but we'll see what happens here. For these 3 students, I'm not going to move the chapter 3 students ahead to chapter 4. I don't want my chapter 4 student to be alone. I'm going to push my chapter 4 back to chapter 3. That's what I'm thinking, either 3D or 3E. And it makes sense for the student because I'm thinking 4A, beginning of chapter 4, not that far away from the end of chapter 3. In looking at chapter 6, I'm thinking my students are pretty close here. So we either will start in 6B or 6C. We'll see what it looks like. So let's look at some details here. So I have my students, my chapter 1 students, chapter 1B, chapter 1D. So these are both students I would need to look at chapter 1, but different sections. So here I have my choice 1B, 1C, 1D. So student 1 I thought would fit well in 1B. Student 5 I thought would fit in 1D. So let's look at the differences here. The student that I have that I'm thinking 1B would be working on patterns. So it'd be basic beginning patterns, clapping, rhymes, attempting those. Also connected to their day, following their daily routine, anticipating a holiday or event based on the season. Like, our holiday break is always in the winter. Um, Thanksgiving's always in November, that kind of thing. Following the schedule and anticipating favorites. If I know that I love speech and it's every day after lunch, I can anticipate that's going to happen after lunch, right? It's that kind of pattern that's linked to students' day. That's what that's about. So I look a little bit further. I'm matching and sorting here. I'm thinking that that's a need for my student is the matching and sorting because I was going to place my student here in section B. So I'm thinking I might still have to do that, get at least some of this about patterns in place for my student in section B. And looking at section D, my student is going to be working on expanding what they know about attributes, right? So when I think about all of this and I look at some things where it says anticipate special event on calendar and the 4 seasons, that rather connects to 1B. So why not start both students perhaps in the middle or towards the end of 1B, either 1B3 or 1B4. And that will serve as a nice review for my student before getting to 1D and looking at those 4 seasons and special events. Those are nice skills to come first. And of course, the matching and sorting, that review also is beneficial for my student in 1D because we're doing that here too and only applying it to shape. So having that student review all of these things, I think is well worth starting both students at the end of 1B. And I would pick 1B4 as the place to begin. for my students in chapter 3, it's either 3D or 3E because my student in chapter 4 is going to have to be pushed back. Now I can quickly look at chapter 4 and I see that that is about composing and decomposing numbers 2 through 10. All right. So I go back to 3 and I see my other two students would be in object graphs and pictographs here in section D, or section E, predictions and bar graphs. So you think about those in relationship to the amounts and amounts that we put together to create graphs could be a nice prerequisite skill, or at least review for the student who I'm thinking would be starting in chapter 4, right? We were going to look at chapter 4 here in that very first section. So I'm thinking this could work. Starting students somewhere here in section D as a compromise to give students that experience in graphing to move ahead and then to move forward with the some of the numbers and operations kinds of skills. I'm thinking that's pretty legitimate. When I go back and look at Venn diagram can be pretty difficult, and that's not a bad place to start, right? That might be where I start my students is 3D2 here, or I'll check my students about the Venn diagram, see if they can do that. Maybe I'll start a little bit further on in that section. Okay, so we've looked at those students starting in section 3D. I'm going to check it a little bit further, but just make sure where I want to start all those students together. And then I have students who are here either in place value and numbers to 50 or in measurement in money. So when I look at numbers to 50 in place value, it looks like students start with counting 11 to 20. They're ordering quantities, counting 1 to 50, skip counting to 100, and then we start in on place value. In measuring tools and money, we have some crossover here. These serve as prerequisite skills for 6C. And that's the way, right? These are the ordered lessons. They should do that. For example, I couldn't teach my students how to use a ruler or what the ruler means if they don't understand or have had experience with the amounts of 11 and 12, because a foot goes up to 12 inches. And if I'm looking at these tools, I want students to know what they're looking at and have that experience with those. So there's also ordering quantities from most to least, and that's what measurement tools do. They order quantities from most to least. So that brings those skills together. Also, the amounts of money and the coin amounts are within this realm of a quarter is within the amounts of 21 to 50. So having a review of the numbers in section B would be a good idea for the students who I wanted to start in section C. So if I want to pinpoint this, I might do a quick check on my students in section C and see what's valuable for them. I also might do the same for my student that was placed in section B to see, does my student have any skills in here that maybe we could start a bit later and, you know, go a little bit beyond the beginning part of 6B. But all of this, since it supports section C, I think is worthwhile for students to have those experiences and move from learning the lessons in B wherever we start, and then followed by section C. So that's looking at those content pages, but I can do the same by looking at the electronic scoring. So in electronic scoring, I have several tabs. There's the instruction tab, as you can see at the bottom here. And then the assessment tab brings up this. This is all by subtest, right? So all the subtests are here. I'd scroll down to get to the rest. You also see the lesson and the lesson objective here as well. And that's pretty handy, right? So I can go through here, and instead of using the assessment to fill in these scores, I can just use a 1 to indicate that my student knows that, or I've seen my student demonstrate that they know that. Either I know it or I've seen it, right? And I can mark that down here when I've completed that for each of my students. And each of your students would need their scores on a separate um, electronic scoring tool. So you would have, if you had 6 students to look at, you would have 6 of these on your desktop, right? 1 for each student. So once this is completed, I can move on to the next tab, which is chapters 1 through 12, and I have a view of that. All of the scores that I inserted in that first tab in the assessment page, they show up here in the lesson order. So it kind of looks like it is the assessment that's right here, but it's not. These are uh, these are in the lesson order, not in the subtest order. That's what I meant to say. They look like these are all the subtests in that same subtest order that we saw, but they're not. You can tell because what's on left is how they're sorted by. So when I look in the previous screen, I see on the left, the subtest is how these are sorted. You can see how many patterns in algebra there are, and they continue, right? Or on this page, patterns in algebra stops after 5. Well, that means they're ordered here by the lessons on the left-hand side. So now I'm seeing, well, how would my student do in the lessons themselves, in this view, right? So all the lessons are represented in the equals assessment in this early version of equals. So the version that you have, equals 2.0, there's a lesson assessment matchup, almost identical. I think there's a couple that were combined, but most of the lessons have a corresponding assessment item for it. So you can easily see strengths and weaknesses within the chapters that way. So if at all you have an opportunity to provide the assessment, you'll get a pretty full view. But you can also get that full view if you know your students' math skills. And you are able to then compare student skills for placement within a chapter in this entire document. So it's very similar to using the contents pages, but it is organized in such a way that you also can see where those subtests begin and end. That gives you a little bit of a different view. And again, of course, we know that grouping is a compromise. So try out each tool, see which one you feel more comfortable with, which one you feel supports the information better, and then choose that one. It really is, your own preference. So that is essentially placement. It's compromise and moving students together and seeing the benefits of all students within a group, where you put them, finding what those benefits are. And it doesn't always work out. Sometimes you do have a student alone. And maybe that happens for a year and you get new students and that changes. Or students catch up with their skills and are able to move into a group they weren't able to before. But we do want students to have group members to talk to and interact with. It really does benefit them for their math education. So if you want information on the equals assessment, if you're doing this alternate assessment quickly, there is information. First of all, there are pre-recorded equals assessment training webinars. So they would be located in the same place I gave you before, ablenetic.com/curriculum-resources. Look for equals 2009-2011 training. That's how it will be listed. So you have to scroll down to find it. This is important to know, there are 2 assessment flip books that are small. Since we have 2 versions of equals, I like to point this out. In the newer version, they're large sized, like an 8.5 by 11 sized sheet of paper. These are half of that. So you have the short books, then you have this 2009-2011 version. You'll want to get your assessment flip books, an overview manual that'll help you, that has information about the assessment. You also want to look in members only digital content in the assessment folder, the equals assessment folder, which includes an answer key, the equals assessment kit, which you're suggested to provide kits prior to assessment. It's easier for you. That electronic scoring tool I told you about, and there's more. So to support if you're actually given the equals assessment, make sure you check all of these things out. Thank you very much for your time. If you need further assistance, call AbleNet customer service and they will get in touch with an expert that can help you out. Thank you.